The Lost Year, Chapter 16, Storm. Merlin and Arthur had stayed in Camelot for 3 weeks. A few of the knights needed that much time to recover. It was heading into autumn when they set out again, and there was a brisk wind blowing through the trees. Normally, that would make Merlin shiver, but she'd been gifted a cloak and new set of gloves from a close friend, or that was how Gwen had phrased it. It was close enough to how Leon had phrased it that Merlin knew they were from Arthur. That, and they were much better material than she would normally be able to afford. The gloves were lined with doeskin, and the cloak was thick and woolen. It was nothing that would raise eyebrows at a servant owning it, but they were nicer than she'd ever had. Nicer even than the green cloak Morgana had once gifted her, lost when she and Leon were captured by the bandits on their first foray into searching for Morgana. There was some of the same embroidery on the edges of the cloak, around the hood, that there had been on the shirt and neckerchief Arthur had gifted her through Leon. She suspected Gwen's handiwork. At each corner of the cloak was a bird in flight. The cloak was a deep forest green, the embroidery a shade lighter than the fabric this time. Merlin absolutely loved it. It kept the biting wind out, but sadly did little for the rain when it kicked up out of nowhere. They were nearly 3 days' ride from Camelot when it came. The storm was fierce and came without any real warning. Horses bolted as lightning flashed and thunder boomed. Merlin's mount was one such, and unfortunately for her, she happened to still be astride the thing. Times like these, she wished she'd still been allowed use of Dancer. Near nothing could scare that horse. But she took comfort in knowing that Arthur was astride her instead, as the forest flashed and tore at her. Rain pelted her like stones. A particularly loud crash of thunder had her horse bucking under her, screaming in panic, as lightning forked down into a nearby tree, splitting it in two. Merlin let out a scream of her own as she went flying. She expected the crash of hard soil beneath her when she landed, maybe the smack of mud. She did not foresee a splash as she tumbled head over heels into a river. Her gasp was ill-advised as it filled her lungs with yet more water as the storm raged. Up and down lost their meaning as she fought for a surface she was no longer sure the water had. Lightning cracked beneath her, and she fought with the raging flow of the water, trying to turn when another almighty splash sounded and her world went dark in a spray of shattered bark and broken branches. The storm had blown through with the wrath of an angry god. Isildur frowned. Several tents had been all but shredded, though since the storm was over, the repairs were already underway. He'd sent out a few foragers to replace supplies or locate the lost ones. He had just finished sewing together a section of one of the tents when a whistle sounded, announcing the return of one of their searchers. Olenna, one of those skilled in the bending of the elements around her, called for a healer as she re-entered the camp, a broken tree walking beside her. Atop this makeshift stretcher laid a familiar figure, though he'd only seen her once. He had never forgotten that moment. He'd gotten word from a young girl who had recently escaped Camelot, running in the wake of the manhunt for the young druid Mordred and his father. He had not known who to expect, or if he would be ambushed when he went to the rendezvous spot detailed in the message the girl carried. He'd reached out with his more abstract senses first, and nearly been blinded. A fallen star rode atop the horse with the young boy. She was a figure out of legend, wearing the skin of a young girl. Emrys finally given flesh. In front of her on the horse rode the young druid boy, Mordred, looking no worse for his stint in the dungeons of Camelot. Beside her rode the king's son. That had been almost a bigger surprise than Emrys living among them. There had been rumors for years that the goddess's champion had been born. Seers woke screaming, watching the trials she would endure, and those that had already passed. But Isildur had never thought that he would meet her. nor that he would see her again, soaked to the bone, scratched and bleeding, a wound on the side of her face. He leapt to his feet as those with magic sight reeled, clearly having attempted to identify if the newcomer was one of them. "Nadir, Elias," he called, their two best healers rushing to his side. He gestured for Olenna to bring Emrys into the tent, one of those still standing. She did so, leaving when he nodded for her to do so, after Elias and Nadir lifted Emrys from the walking broken tree, which followed Olenna out. Whispers were kicking up in the crowd outside, but Isildur did not let them distract him. The good news was Emrys was not badly wounded, save for swallowing quite a bit of water. He would guess Olenna had found her near or in the river. The wound on her head was mostly superficial. Head wounds simply bled a lot. She was resting comfortably when he left the tent, leaving Elias on guard. Nadir followed him out. "She is real," he muttered, and Isildur nodded. "She is. That means the time of legends is upon us. The goddess's champion in the flesh," Nadir gushed. Isildur shook his head. "She is a child with a great destiny, but one I suspect is already putting too much pressure on her as is," Isildur said as the others gathered around them. "The more she knows of the prophecies, the more danger she is in. Her and her destiny," he stated, and the others nodded. Gilda, their seer, nodded and spoke. "Isildur speaks true. I have seen many futures. All those where she knows the full extent of the prophecy end in darkness. We must be cautious as to how much we reveal, even to the goddess's champion herself. She must be allowed to discover these things for herself," Gilda advised. Many more nodded. A few others looked contemplative, but agreed. They drifted back to their tasks, each of them looking back at the tent every few minutes, waiting for Emrys to awaken.